During almost all of the governor's speeches during this week's statewide campaign, it hasn't been too hard for him to generate excitement and draw some strong supportive applause. But even with a basically identical speech, tonight's audience merely listened. The governor's message was delivered in a hot, muggy, unair-conditioned auditorium, and the teachers, parents, and other educators in the audience didn't reflect that same excitement the governor saw earlier today in two other speeches. What the governor is pushing for is reform, specifically budgetary reform that he says would bring the budgetary process out of the basement and isolate it such that it would be the subject of strong scrutiny. One of the governor's dislikes about the present system is not only the fight among all of the lobbyists for state dollars, but particularly the bickering among the lobbyists for the various factions of education.
And when it infringes on the public interest, that's when it is the duty of the governor to dust them off a little bit. And that duty does not bother me in the slightest.
The governor's road trip won't continue until next week, but he is reportedly planning a long weekend of meetings with state and local officials about his reform measures. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News in Opelika.
Won in the state court a writ of mandamus against Fob James as governor and receiver of our penitentiary system to require him as governor under the broad powers and flexible powers and responsibilities and duties constitutionally that he has to see that our laws are faithfully carried out and our people are protected, that the individuals incarcerated in our penitentiary system today are the worst kind of people that we've got in our society. Circuit judges in this state are not sending school children to our penitentiary. They're not sending individuals who make mistakes for the first time when it's nonviolent offenses. They're sending the real bad characters. The bad guys are involved in our penitentiary system.
So I would say to the Attorney General, my good friend Charlie, let's get on with the show. You've got high echelon crime out there, drugs going on, white-collar crime, Decatur, Alabama, and I can name others, so I don't want him to get tied up in disguising the real issues. I want him to get after it, or the governor may have to appoint some special prosecutors in some areas to get that work on. But as to his little bitty lawsuit that he's playing with, to me, it is not worth the paper it's written on, and if that's the quality of his work in prosecuting dangerous criminals, then that's maybe a reason to inspect his record very close.
Fact to the contrary.
Granick says it's become incumbent upon him to sue the governor. He says the governor, as receiver of the prisons, is responsible for keeping dangerous inmates in prison and protecting the public. But he says since the governor isn't doing that, it's left up to him.
We found people who had committed 7, 8, 15 prior felony convictions. Assault with intent to murder. Murder. And those were the best, they said. Wait and see if we lose and we're kicked out of court and 400 people are put on the street. If you don't believe we're not facing a crisis, an emergency situation, then you're kidding yourself.
But the governor claims Granick is trying to become part of the problem rather than the solution. He says those inmates on the list are due to be let out within the next 6 months, and they're not dangerous.
So I would say to the Attorney General, my good friend Charlie, let's get on with the show. You've got high echelon crime out there, drugs going on, white-collar crime, Decatur, Alabama, and I can name others, so I don't want him to get tied up in disguising the real issues. I want him to get after it, or the governor may have to appoint some special prosecutors in some areas to get that work on. But as to his little bitty lawsuit that he's playing with, to me, it is not worth the paper it's written on, and if that's the quality of his work in prosecuting dangerous criminals, then that's maybe a reason to inspect his record very close. So I'm
Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
A postman who kicks every barking dog don't deliver the mail.
A place that's sure to live in your memory with values so great they cannot rob is a place we call the Duchy of Emery in the midst of the kingdom of Fob. A mighty metaphor, the king's first love, though he's not exactly meek. Sometimes he forgets who lives above, and who's directing finance this week. Now the Duke of Emery has a protector strong to save him from any harm, but if he's attacked by some large throng, the guard should cling 'neath the good Duke's arm. I guess I should add this little bone, they say the Duke's eyeing the royal throne. The subjects are strong, tough as nails, insist that you do your share, call for sending more crooks to jails, but won't build space to keep them there. There's a road to bypass all the town, supposed to save you gas, but it really makes the poor Duke frown to need a bypass to the bypass. There's been some trouble with the royal treasure. Income tax, you just can't judge it. So they found a money-saving measure. They simply didn't pass a budget. One day there came a big windfall. Surely money woes would leave post-haste. We could teach the kids, house the poor and all, but instead we'll save it so it won't go to waste. Drawing new districts has caused a stir, though the rules seem a little dim. Each representative wants to be sure that the voters he gets will still vote for him. The teachers have their own Father Hubbard. He claims that his kitchen is bare, and no matter how much they put in his cupboard, he says there's still nothing there. Of course, there are the peon reporters, court jesters and fools they be. Not only are they history's recorders, but into the future they see. But the best thing about this kingdom down south is that you can tell your views. So with all of that, I'll close my mouth. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News.
Montgomery County Assistant School Superintendent Lionel Garnier says disciplinary problems will diminish when parents become more involved with their child's education. He says too often parents feel that all the teachers have to do is whip the children to keep them in line because the parents just don't want to be bothered with any type of problem. Garnier says the school system can do very little in disciplining a child if he hasn't been given some basic principles at home. He says it's very important for the parents to mold the child's character during the first 6 years of his life so that when he comes to school, he'll at least have some basic training. Garnier says many times parents are diligent in overseeing the child's behavior until he reaches the 4th grade level. Then he says parents become too lenient by no longer supervising the child or keeping in touch with his teachers. Garnier urged the parents to become more involved with their children's school and social life by joining the PTA, talking with teachers, and keeping an eye on who the children's friends are and where they spend their time. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
It was a day to remember the veterans of wars and the men who spent time as prisoners in those wars. It was also a day of honor for those men who are still listed as missing in action. The expressions on the faces of those attending were expressions of pride and honor for a country they served so proudly and courageously. Former Vietnam POW Colonel Hank Fowler spoke of freedom.
But I've learned perhaps what that word freedom really means. Because to me, freedom is a little like air. You don't miss it until it's not there.
Currently, there are 200,000 ex-prisoners of war living in the United States, with strong indications that there are at least a few hundred Americans listed as MIAs who are still alive in North Vietnam. Those men will be remembered in song. Hospital, Dan Black, WSFA TV News.
Remain standing.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. What an exciting Mrs. Lee, Alabama State Seal, this is our official seal, and also with it, that is a very attractive outfit you wear. Nice.
following that, I want to talk about crime. I asked a federal judge over 2 years ago to make me receiver of the Alabama state prison system.
The Attorney General says Governor James is failing in his duties as the state's chief executive and not looking for alternatives to the release. Today's hearing was on a petition for a writ of mandamus, trying to force the governor to exercise his power to keep the prisoners locked up. Graddick's attorneys told the judge they'd found no evidence that the governor had used these powers. They told the judge the governor could set up tents or call for more temporary units if he wanted to help solve the overcrowding problem. The attorneys say it's time for state officials to take responsibility for state problems and keep federal judges out of it. Attorneys for Governor James asked for dismissal, saying the Attorney General has no standing to go into a court case as a representative of all of the people of Alabama. They say he's never tried to help solve problems in the prison system before and wonder why he's trying to get involved now. They say the governor did consider erecting tents, but decided against the idea because he was afraid of what might happen if all 1,500 inmates in those tents stormed the walls of the prison. But Judge Taylor didn't dismiss the petition for the writ. He just postponed a decision on it. He told both sides to file briefs within 2 weeks on the question of whether it's an administrative duty or a discretionary authority for the governor to develop solutions to the state's prison problems other than the release of the inmates. Unless Graddick's attempt to have the release order stayed is approved, those 400 inmates will be released next Friday on schedule. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
Classroom.
The governor accused Graddick of making a sham out of a serious situation, saying the Attorney General was publicly abusing federal Judge Varner, who the governor says is only trying to improve what he described as a bad situation, the overcrowded prisons. The governor said Graddick was nowhere around as the state battled in court for over a year, securing a new prison site in St. Clair County. James says he has no personal ill will against Graddick, but he feels the Attorney General has deviated from his duty.
When, in my judgment, they leave that duty and engage in extracurricular activity that's both obstructionist, pure demagoguery, and not in the best interest of the public interest of Alabama, then that's when we have to have a little set to.
Governor James also pointed out that Graddick has only prosecuted 29 cases during 1979 and 80, a cue he used to announce Securities Commission Director Thomas Krebs as the head of a new governor's task force on crime.
We've got to make available to every police officer and every prosecutor every resource that the state has so that they can do a better job. The biggest problem we have is that there are certain areas where they either lack the expertise or the time to invest in the cases, and we intend to remedy that by augmenting their forces.
Graddick, spending the weekend at the governor's mansion in Gulf Shores, says he won't respond to what he calls personal attacks. James says he wants Graddick to return Monday and start back as part of the team. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News.
Corruption, whether it be public officials.
In witness whereof I have set my hand, this Area University schools.
The Mekong Delta, in distant places, on land, on sea, and
relinquish their freedom that we might enjoy the blessings of peace and liberty. Likewise, we must remember the unresolved casualties of war. Our nation will continue to seek answers to the many questions that remain about their fate.
The first thing I presume would be to unlax, as Andy used to say. But right now, it's a matter of trying to find out how one lives on retirement. I understand that it's a pretty good job, pays a little short sometimes, but most people manage to survive it one way or the other.
Greencastle, Indiana, Master's degree, Board of Review of Higher Education along East State University.
We are a full-fledged university, the only one in Montgomery. We didn't start off that way. The best accredited university in Montgomery, and I think that is decidedly a new image.
Alabama had plenty of time to build their new prisons, and since that they didn't, I think that what Varner did was to try and get them to build the new prisons. And I don't see that he had much other choice.
So most of them would be free again in about sometime in the fall. And they're picking those that do have early releases and those that have less serious crimes. And if it means making it, where they can meet the requirements that the government has. After all, I guess even prisoners have certain rights.
Them into another jail because they have done crimes, and they should not just be released.
Well, most of the ones are on the verge of getting out anyway. Does that make a difference, do you think?
I don't think they should get them released until it's time for them to be released. They did their crimes, they've got to do their time.
If a person breaks the law, they should have to pay for it. If not, just abolish the whole courts and don't waste the money and time it takes to take them to court and try them. Just, give them a suspended sentence to start with and let them go free.
Well, I think when a man do a crime, he should pay for it, regardless to who they are, black or white. I think they ought to pay for it. Because if it was my own dear son, if he done a bad crime, I think I ought to stay there and pay for it.
Varner's decision to release the prisoners is a wise and timely decision. Governor James's backup of that order only shows that Governor James has streaks of humanity in him.
Only about 60 cases of parvovirus have been discovered at this clinic since April, a sharp contrast to the epidemic numbers of last year. President of the Central Alabama Veterinary Association, Dr. George Millis, says the decrease can perhaps be attributed to a greater public awareness and understanding of the disease. Until 1978, the disease was unknown, and it still remains mysterious. Dogs afflicted with the virus suffer vomiting and diarrhea, and in some cases, the animals die. The disease affects young dogs, and it seems to be most active during the summer.
It's not related to the heat itself, but it is related to summertime, more dogs, more young puppies being born. These animals are susceptible to it, and by them being susceptible, when there's more dogs, and in summertime when they travel, going out courting or whatever, this can spread the disease from one area to another.
Millis says the disease can be transmitted by insects, birds, other dogs, and humans. He says the best way to protect a dog from the virus is through vaccination, although this doesn't guarantee that the dog won't get parvovirus. Once a dog has contracted the disease, measures can still be taken to prevent further sickness or death.
It is purely an intestinal virus, so what you have to do is you give them intestinal coaters, things to help slow down the vomiting, slow down the diarrhea. You give them fluids, force fluids on them, whether it be Gatorade, meat broths, consomme, anything like this orally, to keep the animal's body hydrated so they don't get dehydrated and die of the shock syndrome of that.
Millis says the sickness lasts 5 to 7 days, and if death is to occur, it usually happens in the first 4 days. It's not known why the disease has such varied effects, why some dogs die and some show no symptoms at all, but Millis says much research is being done to discover more effective ways to prevent and treat canine parvovirus. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
The reason I wanted to play because I want to match my skill against their skill, I think I hit the ball as solid as anybody. And most times if I want to play a tournament, I go to Atlanta, Florida, Nashville, Tennessee.
You'd like
Cleveland.
to play more tournaments around here?
I like to play around the boys. This is my hometown. I like my hometown, So I like to play with them,
See who's really the best, huh? From year to year.
Not exactly that. I like to show the people what I can do at the game. I like the game. I like to play it. I'm a good striker of the ball.
Where did you learn to play golf?
Well, I used to catch at Maxwell, when I was a little boy, about 10 and a half, and old John Cuter gave me a set of sticks, And I just started from there, messing around with it, and I was shooting 95, not that good, and then I got down 85, 75, and then I got my own club then, So I've been playing golf I'm 42 years old. I've been playing golf ever since I was 11 and a half, so
You
I
have
paid
been
my
playing a
dues, you know,
while,
yeah. I paid my dues.
Where do you have to go to play in a tournament before the Lagoon Park tournament?
Well, 4 weeks ago we was up in Washington. Went to Washington, clean to Washington playing, just playing up golf tournament. You go to Atlanta, they have a lot of little amateur tournaments. I go to Orlando, Florida every year. Play down there, Disney World tournament. I won it twice. You know, nobody asked me about it. I got a trophy at
No
home.
press, huh?
No press, nobody asked me about it. So Dean, how you coming? Well, I got it, you know. The people who I work with, they know. I bring the trophy, let them see it, you know. And I got trophies at home all around the house.
How come you didn't call me?
Well, when I sit at home and I sit in my den, I look at each trophy around the house, I get just as much pleasure at it than some of the fellas when they're on your show.
Yeah.
State water improvement official John Williford ran tests on the contaminated soil to determine if the potent muriatic acid had neutralized enough since the Friday spill. Officials say the lethal acid leaked again yesterday, but was contained to the area. Residents were evacuated for nearly 4 hours for precautionary measures, but Fire Department Captain Rusty Brock says the corrosive chemical used to clean bricks and buildings posed no immediate threat to the families.
We were able to contain it, posing no real threat to the neighborhood. And the EPA advised us how they wanted us to control it, and we will be moving the chemical away from the area sometime Sunday.
Mayor Charles Price surveyed the area again today and says he's pleased with the cleanup operation. Authorities shoveled soda ash and sand on the 500 gallons of acid that spilled before hauling the contaminated soil to the landfill for final dumping. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News, Prattville.
Ow!
These flowers didn't grow this way. In fact, they didn't grow at all. These flowers were manufactured at Cafco Imports, and they're just a few of many thousands being viewed by dealers from across the nation. Over 260 wholesalers and retailers are in town this weekend for the 17th annual Cafco Convention. The gathering is to introduce the newest of Cafco's lines and to teach the dealers more effective ways to handle their products. This afternoon, Frankie Shelton of the Shelton School of Floral Design in Texas spoke to the convention on many novel ideas employing silk flowers. But Cafco General Merchandise Manager Phil Easter says these are not artificial flowers. He and the other dealers prefer that they be called permanent flowers.
Said we really don't like to call them artificial because they are in the image of nature, most of them, although we have introduced fashion colors as well to the flowers. But we look at them not as a replacement for flowers, which the term artificial would imply, but more as a very important decorative accessory in the home.
Easter says nothing can take the place of natural flowers, but these decorative accessories should be chosen with the same care as a piece of furniture to add to the overall appearance of a room. Obviously, many people agree. Easter says permanent flowers are a $2.5 million a year business for Cafco. Today is the last day of formal activities for the convention goers, but Easter says many will stay for tomorrow to start placing their orders for next year. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
As we travel throughout this country and throughout the world to attract people, we take this film or we send it there. And it served as a wonderful way to communicate what this state is all about. And I think I think the true Alabama is coming through and coming through strong, and I think that it will result in hundreds of thousands of jobs in the next decade.
Alabama, the best of both worlds, a land of serenity and peace, where the tensions of a workday world can be lost in the blink of an eye. But Alabama is also a land on the move, a thriving industrial state working towards the 21st century with purpose. Alabama, a state cut out for business.
Nearly 100 supporters and friends showed up to hear Governor James in this his second week of campaigning for governmental reform. Even among his supporters, many of the questions fired at the governor concerned his proposal to strengthen the Alabama Commission on Higher Education. The governor repeated his stand that there is currently no mechanism to control the growth of colleges and universities, particularly in determining the need for various programs and their cost. But the governor reassured his audience that he didn't favor full control of the colleges and universities, saying he wanted the University Board of Trustees to remain autonomous. This control agency, he says, also is needed at the elementary and secondary level through a defined mission for the State Board of Education. James spent part of his day inside his hotel room meeting with legislators and a brief meeting with Coach Paul Bear Bryant, a meeting the governor later described as a social call. At one point, the governor visited the Taylor Hardin Secure Medical Facility, which has been standing empty for nearly 2 years, but is expected to be open by the end of this fiscal year. The governor said he was impressed with the facility, which will house for the criminally insane, but they questioned the location, saying it might have been better coupled with one of the other existing facilities, such as Bryce Hospital. The Secure Medical Facility is expected to cost almost $3.5 million a year to operate. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News in Tuscaloosa.
On the Capitol on August 9th to dramatize the need for Congress to extend the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This is a life or death situation as it relates to blacks' participation in politics. And I'd like to point out that there are those who would oppose the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but the 1965 Voting Rights Act has never hurt anyone. But if it's not extended, many people will be hurt. So we are going to march on the Capitol from Old Ship AME Zion Church to the Capitol with Reverend Jesse Jackson. This is a high. It's because you got some black person over there on welfare who won't work. Now that's the program out. Not only do you cut out some person who receives government help, you cut out a person who can do about these matters, because this is a very serious matter. We're going to have agencies of government. So in effect, the budget's not going to be cut that much. It simply means there's going to be a different shift. So if your children can't get educated, if your children can't eat, if they can't go to school, you can't build a house, then you call these congressmen from Alabama, because they will have helped Mr. Reed.
Reed says the march will be held as part of the Alabama Democratic Conference's annual convention early next month. He expects as many as 10,000 people to gather at the Old Ship AME Zion Church on August 9th to march to the Capitol in support of extension of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Reed says the extension is necessary to protect the voting rights of all people.
This is a life or death situation as it relates to blacks' participation in politics. And I'd like to point out that there are those who would oppose the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but the 1965 Voting Rights Act has never hurt anyone. But if it's not extended, many people will be hurt.
Reed stressed the importance of Section 5 of the Act, which requires Justice Department approval of any changes in election procedures. Reed denies that this section is discriminatory toward the South. He says Section 5 affects many states not in the South, and efforts to extend the act to the rest of the nation are, quote, a joke aimed at diluting efforts to protect blacks' political rights.
So we're going to be making a major effort to get blacks fully involved in this march, because if we do not pass extend the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and particularly the pre-clearance section, then of course blacks are going to retrogress politically.
Reed says he expects the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Birmingham Mayor Richard Arrington, and Coretta King to be among the marchers. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
Many children going to bed hungry at night in the land of plenty.
Which with care can be developed, hopefully it can be developed as inexpensively. The National Register was set up by Congress in 1960, voted for Mr. Holmes.
It was a decision that was made based on the financial situation within the athletic department, and it was really one that no one wanted to be a part of, but it was the only alternative that we had, and it was one that was made, as I said, based on financial needs in the athletic department, and also the fact that wrestling is no longer considered a sport in the Southeastern Conference, and it does not count toward the all-sports trophy in the Southeastern Conference, and that was a sport that the committee decided was the best one for Auburn to drop. And you know, Coach Melkovich and the wrestling team and Coach Umbach before that have done a tremendous job with our wrestling program at Auburn, and they have great tradition, and it's just it's very unfortunate, but you know, that's I think is the way the times are today, and I'm sorry and concerned, but that was a decision that's been made, and there's no turning back now.
The final three witnesses, all fiscal experts, concluded the intervener's presentation in the telephone company's bid for a record increase. All six witnesses testifying studied Bell's financial and operational status, and together are recommending that Bell be granted an increase ranging from $7.4 to $7.7 million, which is only about 5% of what the telephone company is asking. The last intervener testifying was David Efron, who was one of the Attorney General's key witnesses. Efron was primarily responsible for making the 5% recommendation. During the 8-day-long hearing, company attorneys and PFC staff analysts have scrutinized the intervener's testimony, making sure all calculations, summaries, and recommendations were fair and accurate. And Assistant Attorney General Charles Guyton says he's completely satisfied with their witnesses' testimony.
We think they presented themselves professionally. We think they thoroughly addressed the company's filing in every aspect, and we stand very firm on our $7 million rate increase recommendation.
Telephone company officials return before the PSC next month to present the rebuttal testimony. Then in September, the commission decides whether to grant some, all, or none of the $147 million Bell is seeking. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Position, of course, is that the company is not entitled to supersedious, in that the $4.3 million awarded them was a fair and reasonable return on their property devoted to public service, that there will be no confiscation accruing in the interim, and that ratepayers would be severely burdened if they had to pay an amount equal to the total $12.25 million asking by the gas company.
Philip Browning with the State Department of Pensions and Security says the solo parent program is targeted for young welfare mothers in the 16 to 19-year-old age group. He says most of these women have never worked before or even completed high school. Browning says with the help of the Central Alabama OIC, they're given adult basic education, vocational education, and job placement. He says currently the program is limited to the Dallas and Lowndes County areas and is 100% federally funded. Director of the OIC, Connie Harper, says the program started in March of this year, and 30 young mothers are enrolled in the classes. Mrs. Harper says 14 of them now have unsubsidized jobs and are off welfare. She says these women previously received aid to dependent children, food stamps, and Medicaid. Now each is earning approximately $7,000 a year, which is about $6,000 more than what each received in welfare payments each year. Mrs. Harper says of the 30 participants, 25 are working toward their high school equivalency. In addition, she says 3 have been placed in nurses training, 1 in the Job Corps, and 1 in the Armed Forces. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
There's only been a very subtle change in the governor's plan of attack. He shortened his speech down a little, not because of the oppressive heat in Tuscaloosa Central High School auditorium, but instead because the governor feels he is bombarding his audience with too many facts and to allow more time for questions and answers. The governor says he hasn't received negative response to his proposals, but rather an air of question. Governor James considers this road trip an opportunity to educate the public on his proposals. Scattered among his many audiences have been legislators, many of whom have distinct opinions about the governor's reforms. Among those legislators, there appears to be a division among the oldest of legislative allies, something the governor hopes will eventually work in his favor. Tomorrow, Governor James is scheduled to visit Birmingham, where he is expecting one of his largest turnouts. In Tuscaloosa, Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News.
In your practice of putting, of keeping the putter low, and this is something I'm weak on. It's a comfortable feeling to take the putter back and get it off the ground.
Demonstrate picking the putter up, as a lot of people do.
I can make a normal stroke and probably get the putter up. If you see this, if I have a long putt, I'll take it back, and when I get through, when I'm here, I'm 6 inches past the ball, and the putter's 6 inches off the ground. And this is not a correct stroke. The putter ought to be lower when it gets 6 inches past the ball than 6 inches higher. You got to take it straight up once you get through. This can create bad roll.
You don't want to scrape it on the ground, though.
This is why it's a comfortable feeling getting the putter off the ground. Whereas you have to practice to be able to take the putter back 7, 8 inches a foot and still keep it low to the ground, because it's easy to scuff the putt, and people always got a fear of hitting 3 inches behind it and taking a 15-footer and hitting it 8 feet.
The proposed lounge is located in the middle of a residential section on Wares Ferry Road. The residents are concerned because there's an elementary school right across the street.
There's a church within 150 yards. There's an elementary school within 3/4 of a mile. There's a KinderCare directly across the street.
The petition for the beer application will come up before the Montgomery City Council on July 28th. So now about 100 residents have decided to band together and fight the application. Many of the residents voiced their displeasure of the proposed establishment by calling it a public nuisance, while others say the lounge will lead to drunken drivers and cause their property values to decline. Jacob says he's not against any individual having a business, but says he doesn't think the lounge will benefit the neighborhood. After the meeting, those present signed petitions which they plan to circulate throughout the area, and over half of the residents at the meeting say they'll attend next week's City Council meeting to protest the liquor license. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
Selma, Alabama holds special memories for the original Freedom Riders, John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette. Their bus never made it to Selma on the first journey. It was met by members of a violent mob whose influence helped detour the bus. But that didn't stop the then 350 riders on that original tour, nor their goal to get blacks in Selma and in the South registered to vote. Today, city officials say over 14,000 blacks helped elect 5 black city councilmen. 20 years ago, less than 200 blacks could vote. That had special significance for Dr. Lafayette, who was named an honorary citizen of Selma, something Lafayette says he never dreamed would happen.
we did not expect to live. We expected to give our lives, but for a good cause. And I am tremendously moved with this honor.
The 30 Freedom Riders, including Dorothy Cotton and C.T. Vivian and Selma followers, then walked across the historic Edmund Pettus Bridge, another memory for most. The group, whose tour began in New Orleans last Sunday, leaves for Tuskegee later tonight. The Riders visit Montgomery Thursday, where Mrs. Coretta Scott King is expected to address the group. Then it's on to Atlanta for the final commemoration of the Freedom Riders' 20th anniversary. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News, Selma.
A small group of Coalition Against Hunger members picketed the governor's breakfast speech this morning, but drew little attention from the governor as he campaigned for governmental reform to a large group of supporters. His audience was even larger, with a Dutch treat luncheon, more than 500 people. Accusing the legislature of a near-secretive budget process and education of being so politicized that priorities are lost, the governor drew a warm applause. The governor says he's getting legislative support on most of his proposals, particularly his budget isolation bill. The governor now says he's gained the major support of the House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Walter Owens and Senate Finance and Taxation Committee Chairman Richmond Pearson. But even with this latest support, the governor is still campaigning strong.
An enlightened, enthusiastic public, you ladies and gentlemen, are going to have enough interest to let your elected representatives in the House and Senate know precisely how you feel. And to those ends, I ask your support.
On his proposal to define a mission for the state school board, Board Vice Chairman Martin says he agrees that there is a need for more authority on the board's part in setting elementary and secondary school policy. Tonight, the governor will continue and concentrate on his education reforms. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News in Birmingham.
Action on get Montgomery County a building that we're going to really be proud of. Because it was the 10 and 2/10 absolute appropriation. Find in a child as a child who's deprived of parental day in day out. In this particular case, recipients are given 2 additional work reduction fees. The standard need for family 3 at this point is $192 plus for assessments. And she lives with her parents. A mother on 8 dependent children without requiring her to have a job or to work unless she had some little bit of children that she couldn't get cared for.
By the increase in Social Security tax rate, the base that was established effective January 1st, 1981. This tax, by the way, pays approximately counties. The $378,000 are fixed by law as well as the Hogan had, but you probably had some newer information over last year, and I believe it was had the luxury of removing the increase in the feeling pretty comfortable with it. It considers purchases. Additionally, revenue growth. I don't have the gross collection figures for our department, but I have the net.
You agree with the 2.6?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Then you agree with the May figure of 6.7?
It was.
The company's 19 employees were told in January that the Phoenix City headquarters would be closing in July. Many have already been relocated to other telephone company headquarters in Alabama and Georgia. Bell officials say they're consolidating this office into their Montgomery headquarters to keep down expenses as well as the cost of telephone service. They say customer service in Phoenix City won't be affected by the move since it's handled through a computerized information system. But the PSC ordered Bell in May not to close any more local offices until the commission could investigate their operation. Bell appealed that order, saying the commission didn't have the authority to make them keep the branches open. Meanwhile, Bell had already adopted plans to close the Phoenix City branch and the Jasper Telephone Company headquarters, which closed 2 days after the PSC's order. Company officials say they were surprised at the commission's injunction request, but feel confident the judge will allow them to continue with their previously announced plans. PSC President Billy Joe Kemp was also surprised that Bell defied its May 27th order.
The company to just go ahead in the face of an order by this commission directing it not to and close that office, in my opinion, is acting arrogantly and in disregard of a legal order by the Public Service Commission.
The final ruling comes next week when Judge Phelps meets with both sides. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News, Phoenix City.
The state teacher certification examination was given for the first time on June 6th of this year. Those who entered college after June 1st, 1977 and want to enter the teaching profession after June of this year were required to take the tests, which were given in two areas: basic professional studies and the field in which the person wants to teach. Dr. Teague says about 900 candidates took the examinations with an overall 77% passage rate. He says these results are in line with other states. In Georgia, about 80% of those tested passed. In Florida, 79%.
I would have been very disappointed had we had a much larger failing rate, or if we had a smaller failing rate. To me, it came out about like I would have suspected it would. Again, though, we must look at each program by institution if this is going to really be a benefit to improving teachers for the future.
But the figures show that the black colleges and universities didn't do as well. 81 students from Alabama State University took the test, but only 11 passed, while Tuskegee Institute had 5 of 23 students to pass. Dr. Teague says representatives from the State Department of Education will continue to work with these schools to help them alter and update their teacher education programs. Dr. Teague says there's no limit on the number of times the test can be taken. The next examination dates are August 22nd and December 12th. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
The Commissioner of Agriculture signed a statewide quarantine of California produce into effect last week, and an inspection program for medfly infestation began today. But the program may not last long. The Director of Agrochemistry for the Alabama Department of Agriculture, John Block, says the state of California has filed for a temporary restraining order against the state of Alabama to halt the inspections. Such an order is already in effect in Texas. Block says the inspections are necessary to protect Alabama produce, including a $3.5 million a year peach industry, from a very real threat.
The conditions that exist in Alabama can support, our evidence is there in the literature, as well as some of the biology that's being worked on the pest in California, indicate that it could survive under certain conditions in Alabama. So, yes, there is a potential.
But not everyone agrees that the flies are cause for such concern. A produce manager for Hudson Thompson's, Dick O'Brien, says the California produce has already passed through numerous checkpoints.
The other states that are involved between California and Alabama are taking all the necessary precautions to inspect product to make sure it's been fumigated.
O'Brien says the flies have only been found in California, and they're only in bell peppers and some specialty items. O'Brien says his firm has canceled all orders for these items. Block points out that this is not a health hazard. It's an economic one. He also stresses that the problem is currently limited to only 155 acres in California, none of which is used for commercial growing. His department has until Friday to respond to California's request for restraint. Until then, the inspections will continue. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
I happen to believe the average farmer in this state and the average school teacher in this state has got too much sense to believe what a high-paid striped suit lobbyist is saying in Montgomery, Alabama. And I don't want to call names, but they are calling names, and it could be inasmuch as the Farm Bureau has attacked like they have, very viciously calling names, that we might ought to take Paul Hubbard and Joe Reed and Goodwin Myrick and John Dara and put them in the same monkey cage and a spotlight on them and let people look at them to see where they really come from, and the public interest will be better served.
That's all right, Mr. Oliver, and well, but I wanted to just be sure that it was not the
On the plus side, full black population, 369. Full black population is 13,694. Percentage of blacks would be 68%. I have worked with this for some time. Plus 1.7, the difference would be plus 2.8. Also, I would like you to explain to this council that were made in this.
I'm going to ask you one more time now.
Well, the entire change was Court and Bel Air are in this.
5 year plus 1.7, the difference would be plus 2.8.
The Montgomery Housing Authority must cut its budget by $323,000. Authority Board Vice Chairman Frank Parquette says the board's first priority should be to provide housing for the tenants. He says all else must go first. Jerry Kaiser says there's no way the authority can recuperate the $323,000. He says the board's only alternative is to cut personnel and services. Board member John Knight says he thinks it's unfortunate that the budget must be cut. He says if the board members aren't careful, countless rules and regulations handed down by the HUD office will result in public housing turning into public slums. Executive Director of the Housing Authority, J.C. Miller, then presented his recommendations to the board. Those recommendations include laying off 51.5 employees, reductions in maintenance materials, cutting travel expenses to the bare minimum, and not putting any money in the budget to replace appliances like stoves and refrigerators. The board didn't agree with Miller's recommendation to cut all employees back to a 9 rather than 10-day work period. Miller says this action alone will save the authority $72,000, but all the board members agreed that the cuts must be made up in some other areas. Miller says he'll get with members of his staff to revise the budget cut recommendations. He says he hopes to present the final recommendation to HUD representatives in Birmingham by the end of this week. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
If you would overhaul a diesel engine when you replace the pistons, the ring, by political drift or by some genius that did not want the taxpayers of Alabama to know for sure how the money was being spent. Therefore, you have a political vacuum, and you set the stage for confusion, for demagoguery, for this.
Money market mutual funds now total more than $100 billion in assets. Despite this sizable sum, household deposits held by banks and savings and loans total $1.3 trillion. Yet the opposition to money market funds continues. Many U.S. senators are calling for more regulation of the funds, but many investors say that banks and S&Ls will become more competitive because of the money funds.
Until recently, until the money market funds, banks and S&Ls have had a monopoly on the savings of middle-class Americans in passbook accounts yielding 5 to 5.5%. And now that 6 million Americans own money market funds, they will not give these yields up without a fight. The alternative is for the banks and S&Ls to become competitive.
The money market looks to be an ideal arena for investors with a small amount of money to make a sizable return on their investment in a short period of time. And when you consider the interest rate is at 16 or 17%, the earnings are a great deal more than what they would be in a savings account, earning 5 or 5.25%. Investors say another point in favor of the money funds is that the money is invested in liquid securities and the typical maturity period is only 30 days. But the threat to weaken the funds still exists. Now it's Washington's turn to work on the consumer issue that's become a political football. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
Earlier in the year, economic conditions led most to believe that taxes would be growing at a fairly slow rate of about 4 to 5%. But during the last fiscal quarter, taxes have picked up, and so are the revenue growth projections. The 12 groups addressing the committee had projections ranging from 5 to 8.7%, indicating optimism about taxes going into the Education Trust Fund, but a majority of the projections were around 6%. There was an even less clear-cut opinion on how those new dollars should be spent. The Finance Department, speaking for Governor James, wants any major increases to go to elementary and secondary school budgets to pay for materials, utilities, and other such expenses, much the same as State School Superintendent Dr. Wayne Teague suggests, except Teague is working with a higher projection. And Teague wants a teacher insurance increase. Education Association Director Paul Hubbard also wants insurance, but in a different form. And he wants a pay raise, saying none of the budgets he's seen has said thank you for a job well done in increasing academic levels. Meanwhile, higher education says it deserves the new money since they claim they've received a proportionally smaller cut of education dollars over the years.
Everyone generally agrees that there won't be enough money to fund everyone's wishes. So the past 2 days have been an exercise in trying to prove that their individual needs outweigh everyone else's. In about 2 weeks, during the special session, it'll be the representatives and senators who'll decide who had the best case. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
University officials say they received a copy of the official test results earlier today and say they want to study the results before making any further comments. But Dr. Gordon Bliss, who heads ASU's Teacher Education Department, says officials were disappointed in the students' performance on the certification exams, adding he thought the students would do much better. ASU graduates failed 70 of 81 exams, while Troy State University at Montgomery graduates passed 7 of 7, and Auburn University of Montgomery graduates passed 25 of 26 exams. Dr. Bliss says ASU officials will now take a good look at the test scores and evaluate the students' weakest areas on the exams. Dr. Bliss says officials will start immediately with corrective action once all evaluations are complete. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Adequate representation in the House and in the Senate. And I said that we constitute 25% of the population around the
comments, and we certainly like to have more input into this project. And you think it is
districts you discussed before this committee.
this is
That's it. Well, I certainly would like to.
Mr. Chairman, I really didn't intend to say anything, but this is the third I've already
Over that many.
in your presence. Possibly the Apostle Paul was not a senator or a representative because he said whatever state he was in, he was content, not whatever district. But I assure you.
Federal prosecutors told the jury that evidence will show that Lewis submitted bids he knew to be rigged by the Snyders. The Snyders' attorney, Ari DeMint, said evidence would show in their defense that the Snyders followed all bid laws and were not guilty of any wrongdoing. Bill Baxley, attorney for defendant Jesse Lewis, said his client was innocent and wasn't even on the job during one period he is indicted for, and that Lewis had no influence over who got the bids for equipment funded by his state office. The trial started at mid-morning today and is being presided over by federal judge Myron Thompson. At least 60 witnesses are scheduled to take the stand in a trial that is expected to take at least a week or more. This is Norman Lumpkin, WSFA TV News at Federal Court.
Commissioner John Vickers led the argument against approval. He says the legislators who serve school boards can receive direct personal gain by voting for the increased benefits bill. The Alabama Constitution forbids a legislator from voting on bills in which he has a personal and private interest. But the Commission's executive director, Melvin Cooper, says because the gain would apply to all school board employees, it would not be direct and personal. At one point, Vickers suggested the matter should perhaps be decided by the legislature, since the debate centered on an interpretation of the Constitution. Another commissioner responded by asking if any legislator could go through a session voting on issues in the public interest without personally benefiting from the resulting decisions. The vote was a tie, and Commission Chairwoman Bester Bonner cast the deciding affirmative vote. The opinion allows those legislators who are also educators to vote without fear of violating the ethics law, but the decision passes the question of constitutional